Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston, and if you've never been to this channel before, this is a place where we do both gear reviews as well as studio tips and tricks, production tips and tricks, kind of aimed at a home recording and guitar player audience. So if that's the kind of thing that might appeal to you, if you're a guitar player who wants to know more both about gear, but also how to take that gear and create great sounding songs and mixes with it, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and stick around. Today we're talking about the Source Audio Artifakt. Source Audio is one of those companies that tends to kind of really build out everything that they do. Whether it's the Ventress or the Collider, any of their kind of big box delay and reverb wet effects, they are both very capable on the face, but also come with the ability to kind of sync up to the Neuro app that Source has developed, which gives you pretty unprecedented under the hood control, access to really kind of like minutia-based LFO changes, little tweaks to get your sound exactly where you want it to be. They are the kind of pedals that really kind of will give the average player everything they need, but really open up the hood for tweakers to really get into. And so it's not surprising at all that when they finally kind of stepped their foot into the lo-fi area, that they would not do it in any sort of half-assed way, but would very much so create something with a lot under the hood. And that's because Artifakt by Source Audio is not just a lo-fi pedal. It is in truth more like 7 different lo-fi pedals sharing a moderately uniform control set. So let's get into that, and I promise you it's not going to be as complicated as you might think it is halfway through this. Artifakt, even at a port basis, is a very, very versatile piece of gear. You have stereo ins, stereo outs, MIDI in, MIDI through. You have USB-C for access to that Neuro app. You have your power, and you have a control input up top as well, which is an excitable expression input. So already, the ways to interface with this via MIDI, expression, and USB is already very impressive. On its face, you have the kind of center of the pedal, both literally and kind of like metaphorically. You have a rotary knob in the middle, kind of where you toggle through the various versions of lo-fi this thing can be. You have radio, tape, verb, crush, ladder, vinyl, and glitch. Even though they are kind of not structured like this, you can kind of gang them together in your head for a little bit of added kind of ease of navigation. Things like radio, tape, and vinyl are all very much recreations of real-world versions of low fidelity. The ability to kind of process your audio as if it's being heard over kind of a slightly out-of-range radio tower, complete with kind of distortion and interference and signal compression and everything else. You have tape and vinyl, which very much so are recreations of old tape machines and old vinyl record players that can kind of degrade and warble and break apart as much as you want them to in this device. Verb is a really interesting touch because it is a basically diffused delay as a reverb that kind of emulates old Belton brick and like really, really early primitive rack digital reverbs. The kind of thing with a lot of noise, a lot of grit in the signal, but also a lot of very nostalgic, kind of brittle warmth, if that makes any sense. You also have things like your crush and your glitch, a bit crusher that is incredibly versatile, as well as glitch, which can almost be thought of as a kind of always listening device that is ready to play back the last couple of things you played at varying speeds and intervals for kind of interesting and gritty pitch shifting chaos. And a really cool but very much dark horse addition to this pedal is Ladder, which is an emulation of like an old Moog synth filter, kind of one of those classic, very pop-centric low-pass filters with varying amounts of resonance in the cue for that low pass. This one gets really interesting because you can do everything from set where the filter sits as a static position and then introduce an envelope filter to that, either in positive or negative space for your guitar. So like your signal will trigger an envelope that opens and closes that filter, and then on top of that is a third level of complication. You can also use the modulation engine in this thing to modulate that filter on a more set LFO-based interval that will then kind of open and close relative to its position, relative to your playing, relative to its position on that filter control in general. And if that sounds inscrutable, I promise it's not. when you get to the sound samples, it will make total sense. And if you are impatient, I have time codes to everything down below. So all the modes I just ran through are a very kind of wide set of different styles and sounds, reverbs, bit crushers, warped vinyl sounds, a kind of digital therme-esque kind of thing, and even a kind of crazy pop filter. The control scheme here is actually more intuitive than you might think based on that. You have 2 small little 3-position switches, and then you have kind of 5 key control schemes. You have vary, destruct, filter, mix, and mod. So it's actually pretty straightforward. Destruct will, with some exceptions, but almost always be the amount of distortion or noise or grit in the wet channel of any of the engines. Filter will always be a filter of some kind. It could be a ladder filter, it could be a low pass filter, but it will always be some sort of filter, which is handy. Mix does exactly what you think it does, with the added benefit of pressing and holding your control input to kind of adjust the master output of the pedal, because some of these things can kind of edge up or down in volume depending on how much distortion you add to these signals and also how much you carve away in the more lo-fi modes. Vary is going to be one of the things that is the most kind of situational. It appropriately will vary heavily depending on the mode you're in. It can do everything from introduce compression in the radio mode. It can be the kind of amount of feedback in the reverb, basically the amount of reverb decay applied to the signal. It can also do things like set that envelope for your filters. And then modulation is going to be a kind of switch position dependent control, alternating between rate, depth, and shape of the LFO running in the pedal. And it's worth noting that shape is almost always an LFO shape, but not always, so pay attention for when those things change up. So having said all that, it goes without saying that there's some kind of learned muscle memory to knowing what does what on this pedal, depending on what mode you're in, because it really does feel more like 7 different pedals, all kind of vaguely arranged around the idea of lo-fi in one device. But you have a little preset button down below that allows you to save and recall presets in the device, as well as the ability to recall them or change parameters via that MIDI input as well, or by using your desktop editor on either the phone or on your computer, which is really handy because if you're somebody like me, the set it and forget it nature of a lot of these kinds of pedals is really valuable to me. I tend to like to find what's the right amount of lo-fi I want for the amp and the signal chain I am working in, or for my use case. Like we did a lot of reamping on that intro track, things like the drums and the intro guitar. You will have heard that we used glitch for the first pass of it, so that kind of as I played, anytime I took a break, those glitchy things kind of rose up and played back. I then went and reamped that entire pass again through one of the lo-fi modes on this as well. Those kinds of things are very much a find the sound you want, save it as a preset, and then you can just pull it back up whenever you need it, which is really handy. We're not going to do our sound samples in the conventional pick a knob and turn through it kind of situation because they are so different in what their use cases are. So the sound samples in this video are going to be structured engine by engine, basically treating them as short demos of 7 different pedals rather than one demo of all the knobs. So if you have a certain mode you want to check out, once again, time codes are in the description down below. That is a great way to navigate a video that will probably be longer than you hope it is. So thank you so much for listening to me. Let's get into our sound samples and let's check out Artifakt. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Music Man St. Vincent Goldie into the 29 Pedals EUNA, the Cali 76 compressor by Origin Effects, and the Benson Germanium boost. We are then going into our amplifier, which is the Victory Amplification Deputy head, and then out to the Universal Audio aux box. We are then running into our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna, and this is what our dry tone sounds like. The Artifakt is getting signal from the line outputs of the aux in stereo. So basically, we leave the aux and then we take line inputs to the Artifakt and then stereo out to our DAW directly. So you're hearing the entire guitar rig into the Artifakt for these sound samples. The way I want to go ahead and approach this thing is by, rather than doing a knob by knob analysis like we do in some videos, because this thing is not so much a single lo-fi pedal, but is instead a bunch of different lo-fi pedals all kind of crammed into one device, we are basically going to go around this rotary knob in the center of the pedal, take a look at each engine, explain what it is, what it is that it's doing, what each of these switches and knobs are doing in that context, and then just kind of do some sound exploration, and then we'll move on to the next one. There is, of course, a much deeper level of digging that you can do in a device like this. Source Audio has an app on both iOS and on desktop that will really let you get into some heavy duty, like nitty gritty of the internal sound design stuff. But for the sake of brevity, or as much brevity as can be promised on my channel, we are going to take the pedal at very literal face value here. The radio engine is a great place to start on this thing because it really does highlight a lot of what makes the Source Audio sound design approach so compelling. And by that I mean, when you're doing like a lo-fi radio sound, it is really easy to just kind of take that kind of easy approach of putting a kind of bandpass filter on your signal, adding in some white noise, and heavily filtering some kind of like random LFO modulation. Instead, what Source Audio has elected to do here is basically they've created a lo-fi radio sound by doing static frequency filtering, an LFO-controlled noise generator, and for good measure, they have also put in a very fast, low in the mix ring modulator to give that sense of kind of like a faraway radio tower interfering with the signal you're hearing. The knobs and switches in this mode are going to be bandwidth is going to be the fidelity of the radio signal from full frequency to mildly lo-fi to full-on old-timey radio in low. Vary is going to be the amount of compression applied to the signal. Destruct is going to be the frequency of kind of like interference pops and hisses and just kind of distortion, very reminiscent of driving on the freeway about 10 years ago when you were using a iPhone radio transmitter to get your kind of like your old iPod on your car stereo when you don't quite have the right station dialed in. Filter is going to be, of course, a low-pass filter, darkening up that signal and doing a lot of work to filter and soften up some of the destruct noises. Your mix is exactly what you think it is. The modulation is going to control the rate, the depth, and the shape of the modulation waveform applied to the audio. moving up now from radio to tape, we now have a kind of like tape saturation, tape flutter, and pitch modulation mode in here. There's going to be the option for a little bit of tape slapback, but this is not so much a tape delay as it is more of like an emulation of an old reel-to-reel style tape machine. Because it's got that reel-to-reel thing. Like I said, you've got some slapbacky delay in here, but you also have things like tape flanging, chorusing, and kind of that general glue and vibe that comes with good old school tape, including like double tracking. Destruct is going to be the amount of overdrive on the tape deck. Your filter is going to once again be a high cut for the modulation, not your dry tone, as always. Vary is going to be the delay time of the tape deck. So that'll be how you dial in kind of that kind of like flanging sounds up through double tracking, that kind of thing. Modulation is, of course, going to be your modulation, including the amount of tape noise in that mod shape side of things, which is basically akin to your tape age. And then your bandwidth toggle is going to be, once again, full frequency range, all the way down to very heavily beat up and old grimy tape, very low fidelity. The option switch on this one is not going to be an on-off like it was in the last one for that tape or for the radio noise. And instead, for this one, it is going to be an optional tap tempo for your modulation rate. So let's give it a listen. So next up in our walk through all of these modes is going to be the reverb, which is a really interesting addition here because it's a very kind of primitive, simple, vintage style reverb. It's based on kind of like really old school kind of delays with diffusion, early 8-bit digital reverb sources, as well as kind of some belt and brick style kind of like obfuscated spring for good measure. The control scheme in here is really interesting. The vary is going to be basically your regeneration. The bandwidth is going to essentially be the fidelity from super clean down to progressively more and more garbled and kind of artifacty in its kind of like almost bit crushy quality. Destruct is going to be like overdrive applied to the reverb signal, which makes for some really cool broken reverb sounds. Those things can all be kind of compensated for with, of course, a low pass filter. And then over here, you have your modulation wheel with rate and depth of the modulation, as well as a mix control for the amount of kind of noise in the modulation as well. In this context, the option tap is going to be a kind of like runaway oscillation, which I actually think is really, really effective because it onsets pretty slowly, which I think is an underrated way of dialing in that kind of thing. Next up, we have crush. So crush is going to be exactly what you think it is. It's a bit crusher. Everything here is going to be very straightforward. Destruct is the intensity of the bit crusher. The filter is actually going to sweep through a ladder filter. The vary is going to adjust the sample rate. And then the modulation is going to be the rate of the sample rate reduction modulation and the depth, as well as the LFO controlling that reduction. Your bandwidth toggle is going to be 3 different EQs, a clock radio, a portable amp, and a full range at the highest. And then the option switch over here is going to be tap to add pitch modulation. So you basically have 2 different versions of modulation in this thing. You have a sample rate modulation and you have a pitch modulation as well. Let's give it a listen. Worth noting at the outset of this is one of the only ones where vary is going to move in the opposite direction. So you want vary at the very top, and then it will reduce that sample rate as you push through. Okay, next up we are taking a look at the ladder, which is essentially a filter, low-pass style filter, kind of designed to emulate like the old Moog MF101 style, kind of like resonant low-pass filter, a very poppy, quacky style filter. It can be set to be responsive as an envelope to your playing. It can be set as an automated thing with the LFO, or you can have it just set as a static amount of filtering that you can kind of set and leave, and or kind of, automate with MIDI or automate with an expression pedal over MIDI or your control input, that kind of thing. So basically you have the destruct, which is going to be the self-modulation of the ladder's filter's internal overdrive. You have the envelope control here for vary. So in noon, it's going to kind of not move on its, or in response to your playing. If you go down, it does an inverse envelope. If you go up from noon, it is a kind of traditional envelope follower filter. Bandwidth is going to be how resonant the cue is on that filter as it opens and closes. This is, of course, your filter, of course, your mix. And then over here, you have your LFO rate for controlling the ladder filter, the LFO depth for controlling the filter, and then the shape of the filter, of course. Let's get into it. Oh, and the option is going to add an echo, a like stereo echo, which is just kind of a cool added piece of the puzzle here. So first things first, let's just hear kind of the resonant version of this filter by itself. And now let's go ahead and use that vary to kind of activate the envelope follower version of this. The closer you leave it to noon, the less dramatic the effect, which means the more open you have to leave it if you want it to react. But the more you crank it, the more you can bring that down and you'll get these big. Kind of a fun little feature there. Yeah, that is the weirdest envelope filter I've ever heard my entire life, and it's super rad. Okay, next up, let's take a look at the vinyl mode on this thing, which is a really interesting one because in stereo, there's some interesting stereo widening things going on with it, but there's also just an interesting kind of approach to vinyl. Much like the radio one, you could just apply a LFO and some noise and a ladder filter and call it a day. But instead, we are dealing with a lot of filtering, a lot of noise with pops and skips and all that stuff. You also have a customized pitch vibrato in here to sound more like a old vinyl record than a lot of the other LFOs in this thing. The vari control is going to be your drive or saturation of the vinyl engine. Destruct is going to be pops, scratches, and surface noise, as you can hear. Filter is going to be the overall treble level in this kind of like vinyl recording, so to speak. Modulation is going to be the LFO rate, the LFO depth, and then shape is basically going to be a high pass filter on this one. And then you have, of course, full range, a mild lo-fi, and very lo-fi, emulating an old Victrola record player. And for added fun, option here, press it to basically splice a skipping portion of the record, press it again to release it. And that brings us at long last to our final engine of Artifakt, the glitch mode. Glitch is really interesting because it just kind of grabs pieces of your playing as you go through and then basically plays it back in random rates and intervals. It's envelope based, so basically it won't interrupt your playing while you're playing, but once you stop, it'll start playing things back, which is also cool because mix will allow you to kind of still play through at full volume, and then it will bring in those kind of weird playback moments at the same volume. And this basically operates more as an overall control for how loud those things come back at, as well as kind of whether or not your dry playing is affected by the rest of the device in this mode. Destruct is going to be distortion in the kind of like playback, The filter is, of course, going to be a ladder, kind of low passy kind of thing. Vary is the threshold that glitch waits for to listen and then to play back. So you can basically make it so that it is only going to start playing back when your guitar is totally silent, or you can have it so it kind of does battle with you a little bit more, which is, again, where that mix can come in really, really handy. Bandwidth is going to be the sample rate of the playback stuff. Option is going to be clearing the playback, because otherwise it will just play back for forever. Or you can press and hold it for kind of like a record stop kind of thing. And modulation is going to be your rate and your depth of your LFO, but then the shape is actually going to be the intervals that are kind of being played back. So you can kind of sweep from an octave to an octave and a fifth, and thirds and fifths and triads and kind of everything, chromatic stuff and everything in the middle. It can go from very quantized, easy to listen to stuff all the way through very melty nonsense, which is quite fun. So let's give it a listen.